You know, we often think of progress as this nice, steady, upward climb. But what if I told you that's not how it works at all? What if progress is actually a storm? A really powerful, disruptive force that's constantly churning up our economy and society, creating winners and losers in its wake. Well, today, we're going to break down that very storm.
All right, so here's our game plan for tracking this storm. First up, we're going to get to the heart of this gale of destruction and meet the mind behind it. Then we'll dive into what happens when we try to, build a wall against it by rescuing failing businesses. After that, we'll look at a whole nation where those winds of innovation have kind of died down. And then we'll watch a full-blown revolution happening right on our dinner plates. And to wrap it all up, we'll talk about how we can all learn to navigate this constant, turbulent change.
So let's just kick things off with a huge question. What is the real engine of change in the world we live in today? I mean, is it the visionary entrepreneur? Is it some groundbreaking new tech, political maneuvering, or is it something a lot more chaotic? Something that kind of mashes all of those things together into one relentless process? Well, one economist had a pretty radical answer.
The man behind this whole idea was Joseph Schumpeter, and let me tell you, he was every bit as dynamic as his theory. This guy was no stuffy academic. He was passionate, witty, and he once actually fought a duel to make sure his students could get the library books they needed. He was a force of nature in his own right.
And this was his big idea. Schumpeter basically said that capitalism doesn't just evolve peacefully. No, it gets revolutionized from the inside out by this constant storm. New ideas, new technologies, new ways of doing business, they don't just compete with the old ways. They completely annihilate them.
And that's what's so wild about how Schumpeter saw competition. For him, it wasn't just, two companies fiddling with their prices to get a little edge. It was all-out war. It was a new innovation striking right at the foundations of a massive industry, threatening its very survival. Think about how smartphones didn't just compete with flip phones. They made them extinct. That's the idea.
Okay, so if this destructive process is so crucial for progress, what happens when we try to stop it? Let's take a look at the whole idea of bailing out companies that are on the brink of failure.
Well, from the viewpoint of the Austrian School of Economics, which really champions free markets, a company going under isn't the problem. It's actually the cure. It's the market's way of shouting, hey, these resources, the people, the money, the buildings, they aren't being used well. Time to set them free so they can be used for something new, something more valuable.
This ties right into a classic economic idea called the broken window fallacy. The gist is this: we see the obvious stuff, like paying a guy to fix a broken window. What we don't see is what that money could have been used for instead, like buying new shoes. It's the exact same thing with bailouts. What we see is obvious. Hey, the company was saved, people kept their jobs. Great. But what we don't see are the innovative new companies that never got off the ground because that taxpayer money was tied up. We don't see the future jobs that were never created.
And this all leads to a really dangerous side effect called moral hazard. Basically, if huge companies start to believe they're too big to fail, that the government will always swoop in with a safety net, well, they have an incentive to take on insane risks, right? They can make these huge gambles, and if they win, they pocket all the profits. But if they lose, someone else, the taxpayer, gets stuck with the bill.
But here's the catch. This gale of creative destruction, it's not a given. It needs the right conditions to really get going. So what happens when those conditions vanish? Well, even the most dynamic economies can find themselves stuck in the doldrums. I mean, just think back to the 80s and 90s. Japan was an absolute innovation powerhouse. You had the Sony Walkman, the Trinitron TV. Its companies were literally defining what consumer tech looked like for the entire world. They were the undisputed champs.
But you fast forward to today, and you hear a lot of observers pointing to some cultural hurdles that might be slowing down that innovative engine. A deep-seated fear of taking risks, a career system that can, as some put it, punish irreparably anyone who steps off that traditional corporate ladder. Rigid hierarchies where fresh ideas from younger people have a hard time getting heard, and maybe even a little complacency born from all that past success. All these things can act like a giant brake on that gale of destruction.
Okay, now let's watch this gale in action somewhere we all know intimately, our own kitchens. Right now, there is a massive battle of creative destruction being fought over the food we eat. It's pitting a huge established industry against a whole wave of disruptive new innovators.
And one of the huge drivers of this whole thing is data. Research, like this study out of Denmark, is giving us these crystal clear pictures of the environmental impact of our food choices. It shows that swapping out meat for substitutes can cause a pretty dramatic drop in greenhouse gas emissions. That's a powerful reason for change.
And that data has kicked off this incredible race among innovators to create the perfect alternative. But wow, it is not easy. They're up against these huge technical challenges, right? Everything from trying to mimic the complex texture of a real steak using soy, to getting rid of the weird aftertaste of some pea proteins, to just convincing people that eating something like microalgae is a good idea.
And just as Schumpeter would have predicted, the established industry is not taking this lying down. You have groups fighting back, arguing that livestock is about more than just food. They say it's culturally and socially too precious to be swept aside by what they call zealous oversimplification. It's the classic showdown between the old and the new.
So we've seen this force as a big economic theory, we've seen what happens when it stalls out in a major nation, and we're watching it rage in the battle over what's for dinner. What does all of this really teach us about getting by in a world that is just always in flux?
Well, here's the bottom line. This scale that Schumpeter talked about, it's perennial. It never stops blowing. Trying to build a wall against it might feel safer, more comfortable in the short term, but history shows again and again that resisting this process usually just leads to stagnation and decline in the long run. It seems that progress itself actually requires destruction.
And that leaves us all with a final, really challenging question. If we accept that this constant churning storm is what fuels progress, then we have to make some tough choices. We have to decide what is so important that it's worth protecting from the wind, and what old ways, what old structures we have to be brave enough to let go of to make room for whatever comes next.